Now I'm going to get in trouble. Chuck, would you like to lead us in a prayer?
Beloved Father, we are grateful for the opportunity that we have today to join together in the study of thy divine word. We're so thankful, Father, for the love that you have demonstrated through thy word, for the love of Christ that we came and died for. We ask you, Father, to be with Dale as he brings us the lesson and leads the discussion. We pray, Father, that we may look at the Old Testament in a way that is intended that we understand to do better. We're so thankful, Father, for all that you have done for us and for the privilege that we have that we get. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. 14 months ago, when we ended the study on Leviticus, I passed out books on numbers. Ron reminded me of that. I had forgotten about that. So if you do have one of these books at home, if you bring it back, it'll help out. But I don't mind because I can have more made up. It's that easy. So anyway, what we're going to do with the book of Numbers is we're not going to get caught up in every little verse, because when you look at the book of Numbers, the meaning was derived from two numbering of the census, the beginning of the book and at the end of the book. It has been called the book of journeyings, and the book of murmurings. It's also the fourth book of Moses. When you look at the title of the book, the Septuagint called this book Numbers because this is a numbering of the people at the beginning and at the end. But in the Hebrew scriptures, the book is called Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness, because this book will cover what's going on in the wilderness. The title comes, Good Morning. I'm short some books, Mike, but I'll give you one and I'll have more next week, okay? Now, let me ask a question, too, before I get really started here. We're not having a Wednesday night adult class in here, but how many of you would be here on Wednesday night if we started Wednesday night? All right, we will start Wednesday night. We'll teach the same material Monday and Wednesday, because I'll teach it right now, okay? But this Wednesday night we'll have Bible class in here as well. Sounds good. All right, so the title of this book then comes from the first line of the book. If you look at Numbers, it says, Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tabernacle of meeting, on the first day of the second month in the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying. So what we see in this first verse then, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai. Okay? In the wilderness is an appropriate title because this book will describe Israel's travel in the wilderness from Mount Sinai to the edge of the promised land. Numbers is a sequel to Exodus, which we can see by reading the first verse that we are picking up where we left off in Exodus. The dating tells us that it has been approximately how long since the Exodus. Now I'm talking about since they left Egypt. How long a period of time are we talking about now?
11 days.
Okay.
Wasn't it years? They were in the wilderness. I guess I didn't understand what you said.
Okay. For the whole book of Exodus, okay, they left Egypt, and then the whole time in Exodus they were around Mount Sinai. And they've left Mount Sinai. They're in the wilderness. Okay.
Oh, I misunderstood your question.
I knew you did.
Yeah,
Ron.
right. From the time they left Egypt.
Right.
14 months.
Yeah, about a year. And so some people would say they've been at Mount Sinai for 11 months, okay? And during those, During those 11 months, God has been teaching the people his laws. as revealed in the second half of the book of Exodus and all of the book of Leviticus. Okay? So some interesting facts about numbers. There we go. First off, the author was Moses, and it was written about 1450 to 1410 BC, and it covers almost 39 years. Because remember, they're in the wilderness for how long?
40 years.
And this was why? Disbelieved by
Those 12 spies.
the 12 spies.
10 spies.
Two spies gave a positive report, 10 spies gave a negative report. And because of that, and how long were they spying the land? 40 days. And so 1 year for each day they spied the land, okay? So this period covers about 39 years. And if you look at chapter 1, verse 1, which we read, through chapter 10, verse 11, it covers about 38 years. 21 days. Covers 21 days. Yes, John.
It wasn't, I'd like to add just a little, it wasn't just the fact that people listened to them.
Well, that's correct. Yeah, you are exactly right. They listened to the 10 spies and they bought into what the 10 spies were saying. So you're exactly right. And as a result, God punished them and had them wander in the wilderness until those individuals had died off. They were not allowed to go into the promised land. So you're exactly right. So chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 10, verse 11 covers about 21 days. Now chapter 10, verse 1 through chapter 33, verse 38 covers about 38 years. And then chapter 33 through 38 and all the way through Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 3 covers about 6 months. Okay? So Numbers opens some 13 months after the Exodus. And it records the tragic story and consequences of Israel's unbelief. Okay? What could have been an 11-day journey turned into a 40-year journey, just wandering around in the wilderness. And Numbers has more than 80 claims that the Lord spoke to Moses. More than 80 claims. Because of the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea, in accepting the report of the 10 of the 12 spies, while rejecting the reports of Joshua and Caleb, the generation of the Exodus will not be the generation of the conquest. The mission of the spies lasted 40 days, as we already mentioned, and God assigned 1 year wandering for each day the spies spied out the land. With this time already elapsed since having left Egypt, that added about 38 more years. Almost nothing is recorded about the transition years after the rebellion in Kadesh Barnea. Kadesh Barnea was some 150 miles north of Mount Sinai and some 50 miles south of Beersheba, the southern gateway to Canaan. So the theme then, as the Lord spoke, this phrase is found 45 times in the book of Numbers. And the second theme is obedience and disobedience. So lessons that we will learn in this, and that we have learned, if you look at Genesis, it sets forth Israel's relation with the covenant God, both as creator of the universe as well as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When we looked at the book of Exodus, it relates to the narrative of how God redeemed his people from their slavery in Egypt. He is pictured as entering into a covenant with his people, whom he has purchased as his prized possession. And Leviticus deals with the question of how men are to approach the covenant of God. It outlines the sacrifices and the points of worship. So here we are in Numbers. Since there is very little historical narrative in Leviticus, it takes up the historical narrative that Exodus left off. So when you look at a comparison of Leviticus to Numbers, First off, you look at the believer's worship. And in Numbers, you look at the believer's work. When you look at Leviticus, it talks about the purity. In Numbers, we see the pilgrimage. In Leviticus, our spiritual position. In Numbers, our spiritual progress. Leviticus, ceremony in the sanctuary. And in Numbers, we'll see the history in the wilderness. So, as I mentioned, everything's frozen up on me all of a sudden. Yeah, I don't know. We may have to do without slides for a while. We'll see if it picks up here in a minute. Anyway, so if we look at the introduction, which you won't see in the slide, but Numbers picks up where Exodus and Leviticus leaves off, the wilderness around Mount Sinai. Okay? The people, having been here about a year when this narrative begins, after some organization, guidance from God, the people depart for the wilderness of Paran. It's on this trip that discord among the people begins to grow. Here in Paran, the people rebel, left by Korah of the Levites. Okay, so through this rebellion then, we learn that Aaron has been chosen by God when his staff looms before the people. I'm going to have to blame John for all this because he's done all the changes here and everything. We'll get it fixed before Wednesday night. So departing Paran, the people make their way to Moab. Now, I might be able to see some of this up here. This is Kadesh Barnea. A little hard for people in the very back to see. But this is dealing with the Israelite penetration. And this is the wandering before they get up there. Okay? So after departing Paran, the people make their way to Moab. Their travels are marked by war, by death, and continued rebellion, though God hears their prayers and remains faithful. Here in Moab, just across the river from the land of God, God had promised the Israelites. Balaam is sent to curse the people, but instead of curses, we are only shown God's steadfast love as the curses fail, and the people prepare to enter the promised land. If God is the father and the Israelites his children, the book of Numbers narrates the toddler years then. They are no longer infants living under general guidance and development. They are now learning the true nature of God and how to commune with him. And he has delivered them from bondage and given them law. So how will they respond? Where is God leading them? The book of Numbers answers these questions while laying a foundation in their heart. A promise was made, a king is coming, and will their hearts be ready? When we look at Numbers 1, chapters 1 through 4, God is in the center. The storybook of Numbers is written about the people whose lives are lived between the accomplishment of their redemption and its consummation. They lived between the Exodus and the Promised Land for this many years. They lived in between the times, enjoying the Exodus, but not yet enjoying the full realization of God's promise and the Promised Land. It is very easy for us today to declare these Old Testament books as irrelevant to our lives. I've known people, even people that sit in this class, as I taught New Testament books insisted that they did not like studying the Old Testament at all. And yet, ironically, it's important for us to understand these Old Testament books because it helps us to better understand the New Testament. And many of the things taught in the Old Testament are, in fact, taught in the New Testament. This is a preparation. These stories of the past, and we can see good points for our learning today in these stories. However, this is not the outlook that the New Testament has regarding these books, including the book of Numbers. After describing some of the events that are recorded in the book of Numbers, the Apostle Paul declares, if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. And Isaac, if you'd like to read that, I'll try this again, see if this is going to work. Still not going to work.
Corinthians what?
1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 11 and 12.
Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instructions, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall.
Okay. Now let me just read it from the English Standard Version so you have a little bit different look at it. I'm not a fan of the English Standard Version, but sometimes there are some good things brought out in it. English Standard Version reads it this way: Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. And therefore, this is one of the reasons why we study the Old Testament, so we have a better understanding of God's tolerance, God's patience, and God's love for mankind. We always talk about the fact that the Israelites were his chosen generation, but we must remember that God's love didn't start with the Israelites. Was Abraham an Israelite? No. Was Adam and Eve an Israelite? No. But he loved them. He created them. And he also punished them if they strayed from his word, from his teaching. But the fact is that the Israelites were, in fact, God's chosen generation, that he led them out of Egypt into the promised land. So the instructions in Numbers are directed at us when you think about it. We live as they did, between salvation accomplished and salvation completed. And this is what we're going to see in the book of Numbers. We live between the work of God in accomplishing our salvation, Exodus at the cross, and the time when that salvation will be brought to its consumption when Christ returns. God did not bring Israel out of Egypt to abandon them to make their own way through the wilderness. He was with them that whole time. In the same way, God does not abandon us today to make our own way to the promised land of eternity as we walk through this wilderness that we're walking through today. Yes, Chuck?
I look at the Old Testament as a physical teaching. Everything that God did under the Old Testament law was a physical action. But yet when you get to the New Testament, everything is a spiritual action.
Very true.
It's a type and a type.
Yes.
I've got a question.
Yes, sir.
God has bothered me a long time. We always say that everybody under the age of 20 or over the age of 20 died. But yet I find places where people did go over that was over the age of 20. The elderly. For one thing that I remember out of that the elderly went over. They didn't die. I'm saying something I can't remember the fact. But we always say that everybody over the age of 20, or everybody over the age of 29, but we only have the numbering of the men. So I get confused of all of them dying And then there's some of them dying, and a certain amount of them who didn't go over. Straighten me up.
Well, I don't know if I can straighten you up, but remember there were 10 spies, and all those who believed the 10 spies, there were 2 spies that had a good report. And there had to be some people that believed the 2 spies. Because remember, the 12 spies were all heads of what? They were the heads of the tribes. They were the leaders of the tribe that was sent into the promised land to search it out. And so you look at Joshua and Caleb, God-fearing men who had a good report. They had to have family members that had a believing heart as well. I don't know. Anybody else have any other? Ron?
Well, if I understood what he's talking about, older ones making it into Canaan, right?
Yes.
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 Well, if I understand things right, the ones that were held innocent were the ones that were 19 and younger at the point of their first entry.
Right.
But those individuals would still go through the wilderness wanderings, but they would still enter in at age 60. That's what I'm taught anyway. Whereas
Well,
the
that
ones
would be
older
correct.
would have died
Yeah.
on things, but other ones have manifested unbelief. Of course, Joshua and Caleb made it in. Caleb was 85 years of age when he made it in. There's examples of believers made it in.
Because if you look at 19 years of age, by the time they went in there, 38 years later, they would be what, 57 years.
Well, we remember Caleb, one of the 2 spies that agreed with God. He was 45 when he started, but when they began to separate the tribe, he was 85.
Yes.
So the phrase that we use, everybody under the age of 20 died, is not an accurate phrase. It's
Say that again.
everybody under the age of 20.
Right.
This is the phrase that we normally say in connection with everybody under the age of 20 died. That's not
No,
necessarily true.
everybody 20 years of age and older died.
Yeah, everyone over 20 age of older died.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily true, is it?
Well, no. John?
Passage in there, I don't remember where it is. God does not hold people accountable. He does not hold them.
Well, 19 and below.
When they hit, they would be 40 years old. So those were the ones, other than Caleb and Joshua. Yes, elderly people went into the land, but they weren't elderly. God held people accountable for what they did.
Well, that could be.
Here's and we'll get to it. And I promise Wednesday night, all of these slides that you're not seeing right now, I'll have them and I'll go over them very briefly so you'll see it and see the whole history. But remember this, Exodus, the book of Exodus, is what God has done to set us free. Okay? Numbers is what God is doing to bring us to the promised land. And for that reason, the New Testament makes many references to the events that happen in the book of Numbers. But ask yourself this question. When the 2 censuses took place, who was actually counted? Men 20 years of age and older. And ask yourself, why was it 20 years of age and older? And I'll answer that question later on, but think about that. I mean, in 2020, we did a census here, didn't we? And when you look at the census that was taken in the book of Numbers, the census we did last year was exactly the same way. In many ways. I mean, it was more than just the 20 years and older that was counted. But remember, in the book of Numbers, they counted them by family. Okay? What we do, we counted by family. And we looked at the migration or the movement of the people and everything. And as a result, you see the Democrats are all upset now because they're going to lose some seats. The Republicans are all excited because they're going to gain some seats. So you have all this political stuff. And I wish they'd quit being political and start working for people like they were paid.
The chosen tribe of Levi. All the Levites.
Yes. And when you look at the census, the Levites were not counted. Okay, and we'll explain why on that too. And I'll show you a picture of the tabernacle and how all that was set up as well. Jack?
I may have the wrong understanding. I thought this census was only for soldiers, or protection, to gather more land, just whatever they needed with soldiers.
You talk about in Numbers, the book of Numbers? Yeah, in fact, that's exactly correct. The 20 years in age and older were men who were able to fight. And there was a specific reason for that. Remember, God is preparing them, and they're going to have to go in and conquer the promised land. It's not just going to be given to them. They're going to have to work for it. Just as we have to work for our salvation today, they had to work for theirs as well. And so that's part of the reason for the census. But it's interesting, think about how many people went into Egypt and how many people came out. And we'll answer that question a little bit later too. So, what are the chief temptations of living in the wilderness?
Hunger.
Hunger.
Lack of food.
Lack of food, yeah.
Water.
Water. What was that one?
Animals.
Yeah.
Wild animals.
You mean necessities, not temptation?
Well, all of these can be temptations, but you're right, they're necessities. Because
Same as the New Testament, pride of life, lust of the flesh, lust of the eye.
Exactly right. That's what Peter was saying, and that's what Adam and Eve was tempted by. And Jesus, of course, was tempted by Satan in the same way. Lust of the flesh, pride of life, and lust of the eyes. So the people of Israel were constantly tempted to doubt that there really was a promised land ahead. They've already doubted the 10 of the 12 spies because they were told there were giants in the land, even though there was food plentiful in the land. They didn't feel they could conquer it, so they weren't sure that there would ever be a promised land. And so all they could see with their eyes was the barrenness of the desert. How many of you have ever been in the desert? Not much there, are there? Hot, cold at night, rattlesnakes. There's a few animals, not many. There's rabbits, but not much food there. So all they could see then was the barrenness. And God did not just immediately take them into the promised land, but took them on a journey of tests to prepare them for this goal of going into the promised land. The book of Numbers contains the message of the need to live by faith while walking in the wilderness. And we have that same test today, the need to live by faith while walking here upon this face of the earth. Look at what's going on in America today. And most of us probably feel somewhat that it can't get any worse than what it is. Everything you look at today, they're taken away from us. They've taken prayer out of the school. They've taken God. If some of the politicians had their way, they'd take rid of every thing that reminds them of God out of the Capitol building, the White House, and all of that. So it's a sad situation. We have abortion today. We have dope. We spend more money on the illegal immigrants than we do on the American people, because that's what gets votes. And so America is a wilderness for us today, and as Christians, we have to learn to live in this, and we have to learn to have the faith that God wants us to have. And that's what we're seeing in the book of Numbers. What was supposed to help these people with faith while walking through the wilderness. First off, the presence of God was ever before them. When they needed food, what did they get? They got manna. When they complained about manna, what did they get? They got quail. You can actually see God's humor in some of this stuff. But they never lacked for anything. And here's another interesting thing about it. They didn't have a suitcase full of clothes, did they? The clothes they had on their back never wore out. God took care of his people all during this time. But it was to help them develop that faith. They were infants in a maturing process. They needed to keep their eyes on the Lord who was leading them through the wilderness. Look at Hebrews chapter 12. And Ron, if you'd read verses 1 and 2 for me, please. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2.
Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God.
So, the Hebrew writer tells us that we need to stay focused. We need to keep our eyes on the Lord, just as the Israelites were having to learn this in the wilderness. They had the tabernacle constructed so that worship before God would happen on a regular basis so as to not forget what God has done and where the people were going. Jesus' tabernacle, then, is among us. Look at John, the first chapter, verse 14. Mike, would you want to read that? John 1, verse 14.
And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld his glory. The glory was of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace.
So Jesus' tabernacle, in essence, is among us for the same purpose we have seen his glory. And so it is 1 month after the tabernacle was erected, the people are getting ready to go to the promised land. So when we look at this first census, which took place in chapter 1, verses 1 through 54, the book of Numbers opens with God speaking to Moses, as we've already looked at, instructing him to take a census. Every male 20 years of age and older who are able to go to war, excluding the tribe of Levi, was to be counted. I want you to think about the implications of this census then. Because taking a census was not only a numbering of the people, but it is a political act in which a ruler demarcates and makes a claim upon the people being numbered. As I mentioned earlier, the United States takes a census every 10 years, and last year was the census that was taken here. God's command shows that God is king, and these are his elect people. And so these people were being numbered for God. We are numbered, and we belong to God as well. There is also an important theology to this census. When Israel and his family went down into Egypt, how many were there? 70 people. Now, as they leave Egypt, the men of war, 20 years of age and older, how many do you think they were? Right, 603,550 people. That's in the first census. It goes from 70 people to 603,550 people. Do what? Just the men, yeah. Yeah, just the men, 20 years of age and older. Now, think about this for a minute. What did God promise Abraham? Through his seed. But he also said something else, too. land promise. What else?
The number would be sands on the shore or stars in the sky.
Stars in the sky. Go to Genesis chapter 26 and verse 4. Kathy, do you want to read? Look at Genesis 26, verse 4. And John, if you turn to Genesis 28, verse 14. Yes. Verse 4.
And I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thy seed all these countries, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth.
Okay. And 28, verse 14, John.
Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west, to the east, to the north, and the south. And in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
All right. So 70 souls went into Egypt. They were there in Egypt for a period of time. And by the time they get here 1 year later on this Exodus trip, there's 603,550 men about 20 years of age. These people can still be numbered. God's promises are being fulfilled, but yet his promises are not yet complete. Because the nation is growing rapidly. It is also useful to notice that the tribe of Judah is the largest tribe, pointing to the fulfillment of Jacob's blessing. Go back to Genesis chapter 49, Chuck, and let's read verses 8 through 10. And this is dealing with, yes, Genesis 49, verses 8 through 10, dealing with Judah.
Verses 8 through 10.
Yes.
Due to you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. But the prey, my son, you have grown up. He bows down, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion who shall rouse him. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come. And to him shall be the obedience of the people.
So, Judah is the largest tribe, and this is pointing to this blessing here that was given to Jacob, or the fulfillment of the blessing given to Jacob here in Genesis 49. Now, Numbers chapter 2 is a central point for this section of Numbers. But what we're going to do Wednesday night is we will cover Numbers chapter 3 and 4 next, and then we'll go back to chapter 2. And there's a reason for that that you'll see a little bit later. But when you look at chapters 3, verse 1 through chapter 4, verse 49, what we see is the Levites were left out of the census because they were given special responsibilities in their work as they served the Lord. First, in chapter 3, these are described as being an inner circle between the camps of the other tribes and the tabernacles of the Lord. And they made a ring around the tabernacle, next to the tabernacle, between the congregation of Israel and the tabernacle. What do you think the reason was that the Levites made a ring around the tabernacle?
Because it's so sacred.
They were
It was sacred, yeah. Do what, Isaac?
Well, I was thinking they were, to keep that, I forget how they put it, but, to keep the people out coming in, because they'd be put to death if they was to get close or come near it. Almost right?
No, you're right. Pat, what did you say?
same thing.
Same thing?
I mean, that they were the chosen to be priests.
That's true. That's true. In fact, the sons of Kohath were to guard and transport the Ark of the Covenant, the table, the lampstand, the altars, and the vessels of the sanctuary. Yes, Jack?
Well, I guess it's trying to draw a picture in my mind of all these people wondering, were they, this story tells it like that they were all together at all times.
just how far were they scattered and was each tribe in a different location? For all these people, did they have a tabernacle to take with them in Leviticus?
Well,
I can't draw this picture in my head of
your
how
question's a
scattered
good question. And I promise you, Wednesday night I will have a slide that will show you the picture a little bit better. Tomorrow.
Looking at a picture of the camp.
14 months, they all dried out.
Yeah.
I guess they did.
Take them back for warranty.
There we go. Hey.
Blood red.
So,
Oh,
all right. So what you had is you had 3 tribes here. You had 3 tribes here. And you had 3 tribes here. And you had 3 tribes here. And you had the Levites around this way. Okay? Yes.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Now, I have a diagram in my study Bible about the temple, and it said that the Levites were all the way around, but from what I'm reading is there were Merarites, Jonesianites, and I can't pronounce the other one, quote. Are they all Levites, or they're just different tribes, or explain to me how that is?
Well, you have Merari, you have Gershon, and you have Kohath.
And then Moses and Aaron was on the entrance, right?
Right.
So they're all Levites?
Aaron was the high priest. Okay? And
So my question is just, I'm trying to get my mind, all the millions of people, 603,000 soldiers, there'd be millions of them wandering in the desert in Exodus. And they were able to worship together. Were they together all the time? Were they separated, split out, and some wandering here, some wandering there?
no, they were,
So they stuck with their tribe?
as tribes, they were together, but you have to accept the fact that the big landmass was involved in this, because when you're looking at 603,000 people, how large is the city of Oklahoma City?
Well, that's 603,000 men of 20 or less.
Yeah. And so if you add, let's say we conservatively add another million people. So you can imagine just how large a landmass they were encompassing the whole time. And here's the thing that you have to accept, that they didn't pick up that tabernacle and move it every week or anything like that. Okay? They were in the wilderness wanderings, but they stayed in place here. And I haven't fully answered your question, but I promise you I'll answer it Wednesday night.
Let's close enough. I just kind of draw a picture in my head.
We have to remember that what we're reading seems so small, and yet the numbers, when you spread them out, they're so large.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, if you just picture the size of Oklahoma City and the suburbs.
That's one tribe.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's 2 tribes. But just think about the land mass here involved. And so this was not a small undertaking here. And God was with them the whole time. So we'll continue this study Wednesday night, and I promise I'll have this thing working, and we'll go back and you can see those slides. Because there are some good slides in there I want you to see, okay? So I appreciate your comments this morning, and looking forward to continuing the study. If you have any questions about the study that you want me to look up, I'll do that. And I do encourage you to participate, because within a small group like this, we can hear each other.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm confident I have one.
Okay.
There, so somebody else can have that one.
Maybe I could find it.
If you can, don't worry about it. I'll get
I
some more
think I
made.
know where it's supposed to be. 49.
No.
Hey, Dave?
Yes.
Did you say Wednesday night, chapters 3 and 4?
Yes. Yeah, chapter 3 and 4 Wednesday night.
Good morning. Carry on. I see you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. 7 o'clock Wednesday. Yeah.
Can I hold on to this till
You sure may. You can have it.
Hey, Debbie, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. Y'all doing all right?
Thank you, Mike. Kathy, have a good morning.
Yeah. Some gospel, I don't know what gospel. Goes to our congregation, they have about